Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Christophe Paulussen, and I'm a senior researcher at the T.M.C. Institute, one of the two hosts of the webinar International Humanitarian Law and Digital Technology, Critical Reflections. The second host of this event is the International Review of the Red Cross, whose editor-in-chief, Bruno de Meijere, will also say a few welcoming words after me. In addition to the Asser Institute and the International Review of the Red Cross, this webinar is co-hosted by a number of other organizations, namely one, the partners cooperating in HILAC, the Hague Initiative for Law and Armed Conflict, and that is the Netherlands Red Cross and the Amsterdam Center for International Law. Two, the International Humanitarian and Criminal Law, or IHCL platform, which is an interfaculty research platform on IHL and ICL, in which 14 Dutch and Belgian organizations and universities participate. And three, the Designing International Law and Ethics into Military Artificial Intelligence, or DILEMA project, led by my colleague, Dr. Berenice Boutin. And today's webinar celebrates the common launch of Asser Institute's Yearbook of IHL Volume 2018, which was published in 2020, and the International Review of the Red Cross Volume 102, issue 913, published this year. And volume 2018 of the Yearbook of IHL is devoted to the humanitarian and legal challenges surrounding weapons and new military technologies. And the latest edition of the International Review addresses digital technologies and war. And so considering this thematic overlap, the choice for a co-organized event was quickly made. I'm very happy to see that we're organizing yet another common launch with the International Review of the Red Cross after our successful event in 2016 entitled The Role of International Criminal Law in Fostering Compliance with International Humanitarian Law, Past and Future Perspectives. And I'm sure today's launch will not be the last one either, and we will continue to strengthen the ties between our organizations and between the international law cities of Geneva and The Hague. Now, before I hand over to my partner in crime, Bruno de Meijere, I would like to thank a number of people. Well, first of all, Bruno and his team at the review, including Ash and Stephanie. A big thank you should go as well to the entire ASSA team, including Rebecca, Frank, and our colleagues from the communications and events departments. And moreover, I should not forget our two speakers, of course, Joshua and Delphine, who will be introduced later in detail by the moderator, Rebecca. And of course, thank you, the audience, for joining us. Finally, I would like to mention one very special person in particular, and that is Professor Terry Gill, who is hopefully watching. And as I said at the beginning, this event is co-organized by the IHCL platform, and Terry has been representing the University of Amsterdam at the platform. And he has recently announced that he will step down, having been with the platform from the very beginning, namely the 8th of April 2010, when the startup meeting took place. Now, because of his continued support and loyalty towards the IHCL platform, the other representatives and I decided on the spot, when Terry indicated he would step down, that he should become an honorary member of the platform. And at that moment, I told Terry that I think it would be apt if we do not keep this just en petit comité, but also mention this during a public event, as he definitely deserves to be put in the spotlight. And I think there's no better occasion to do this now, during this event. And that is because Terry has not only been a staunch supporter of the platform, but also of the HILAC lecture series. Moreover, he is editor-in-chief of the Yearbook of IHL and is finally a member of the advisory board of the DILEMA project. So Terry, thank you so much for your devotion throughout the years. You are an IHL giant. We can always rely on you. You are a true inspiration to us all, and we hope you will continue to share your wisdom with us for many years to come. And now I've spoken enough. I would like to give the floor, or better the screen, to Bruno, and I wish all of you a very interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This time from Geneva, and I think this is an important feature of this particular event, the historic links between both Geneva and The Hague when it comes to important developments in the area of IHL. I will keep my remarks very brief so as to leave all the time available for the substance of this webinar with two excellent speakers. Just a few words to explain where the review is coming from and why the review has been working on this topic. The review is later this year celebrating its 152nd birthday, over 150 years old. And I would very much say very much alive and kicking, whereas the founders of the review over a century ago obviously could not even conceive of the topics we're going to be talking about today. We are very much in line with the contemporary realities. And obviously the purpose of the review is to publish critical pieces that hopefully will be impactful in terms of furthering the conversations on international humanitarian law, humanitarian policy and action. The review is a peer-reviewed academic journal published by the ICRC and published by Cambridge University Press 3 times a year. I'm very proud to say, speaking of the 152 years, that the entire collection of the century and a half of material can be downloaded free of charge on our website, including a translation of selected articles in quite a number of languages that have been done over the years by ICRC delegations around the world. A few points before I hand it over to Rebecca for the moderator is that I just also wanted to seize this opportunity that as of this year, the review has a new editorial board for the next 5 years, 11 women, 8 men from 19 different countries. I invite you to check out their profile on our website. It's a truly remarkable group of professionals that will guide me and the review team in terms of making sure that we have the finger on the pulse of the debates that matter for the next few years. Then what is coming up after this is that obviously at all times the door is open from the review side for anybody on this who's participating in this webinar to approach us with a proposal for a spontaneous submission. We prefer ideally to receive a short abstract first, and then we can discuss and assess whether this is something that would fall within our editorial line. Our most recent edition was on digital technologies and war. This is why this debate matters so much. Just a sneak preview of what's coming in the next few months. We're currently working on one edition on the Sahel. Then next is a double edition on counterterrorism and sanctions. And finally, later in the year, we will publish the successful applicants to our global call for papers on emerging voices. Before I hand it over to Rebecca, I thought I should also say something about the topic our first speaker will be talking about, autonomous weapons system. As probably some of you who are interested in this area know, the ICRC announced last month on May 12th, a new position on autonomous weapons system. The ICRC is recommending that states adopt new legally binding rules on autonomous weapons system, including prohibitions of unpredictable AWS and anti-personnel AWS, as well as strict regulations to limit the design and the use of all other autonomous weapon systems. In light of military and technological developments, the ICRC view is that new rules on autonomous weapon systems are urgently needed. This is why a principled and pragmatic guidance has been published, and I will share it on the chat after the webinar has started, in support of multilateral discussions on autonomous weapon system with a view to helping states reach a common understanding on how to address the humanitarian, legal and ethical concerns raised by autonomous weapon systems. Why I'm saying that is that today the two representatives of the ICRC to this webinar, which is Ms Delphine van Solinge and myself, this is not our field of expertise. This is not the topic we work on. However, anybody who would like to approach the ICRC, I will share my email address in the chat, and I can assure you that I will immediately pass on to my relevant colleagues who do work on the topic. Now, without further ado, digital technologies and war. Let me summarize the edition in one sentence. It's over 500 pages long. I should also pay tribute to my colleague Ms Saman Rejali, who was the thematic editor for this edition. Over 500 pages straddling a wide range of subjects. You will understand I will not even begin to try to summarize it. As with all the other editions, you can download it free of charge as a PDF, and I do invite you to browse the edition and dive deep into the topics that you find interesting for your work. So with this, I'm very pleased and honored to hand it over to Dr. Rebecca Mignot-Madavi, who's a researcher at the Asser Institute and the managing editor of the Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law and the Hague Initiative on Law and Armed Conflict coordinator for Asser. And I would really like to take this opportunity to thank both Rebecca and Christophe for this excellent cooperation we've started between the International Review of the Red Cross and the Yearbook of IHL. And I trust this will just be the beginning of a series of cooperations. Thank you so much. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Bruno, and many thanks to you both, Christophe and Bruno, for brilliantly introducing this event. I want to be brief as well. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like, in my quality as managing editor of the Yearbook from volume 23 that will be published this year, pay tribute to my predecessor, Christophe, who has not been formally thanked for his work as managing editor of the Yearbook. The life of academic journals is one of change, but also of one of great continuity, especially when the transition is ensured by someone like Christophe. And this is, of course, fantastic for members of the boards and for the authors, but also it makes it somehow difficult to identify one moment in time when someone has to be thanked and congratulated for his work, in this case for the IHL scholarly community. It has been almost a year that I took over this position from you, Christophe, and I can confirm that you put the bar very high. It has been really an honor and pleasure to humbly try to live up to your excellent management of the Yearbook, and the entire board wants to publicly thank you for your tremendous work. Speaking of smooth transition, Terry, for his part, remains our editor-in-chief until next volume, volume 23, is submitted to Asser Press and Springer and published on the special theme of expert manuals. We'll surely find an occasion, hopefully in person, to celebrate these years under his leadership, but also to celebrate his successor, Professor Dr. Heike Krieger. Hopefully she's also connected. She has already started leading the work for volume 24 onwards on the theme Cultures of IHL, with the new board composed of Eliav Lieblich and Pablo Kalmanovitz. And they deserve, of course, to be mentioned today for all the work that they have started to do for the Yearbook, and deserve a warm welcome as part of the Yearbook of IHL. So today, to discuss IHL and digital technology, we are extremely lucky to have with us fantastic speakers. First, Dr. Joshua Hughes will give a short presentation of his paper, The Law of Armed Conflict Issues Created by Programming Automatic Target Recognition Systems Using Deep Learning Methods. Joshua is a research analyst at Trilateral Research. He works across several EU-funded security technology research projects as an ethics, legal, and societal risks and opportunities data protection manager, sorry. His research revolves around the ethical, legal, and societal risks and opportunities of new AI technologies, and implements by design approaches that ensure ethical and legal compliance are considered during their development and use. Joshua's PhD thesis is also quite relevant for our discussion today. He looked at how autonomous weapon systems are controlled by multiple actors, and how this relates to sufficient legal regulation of the development, use, and responsibility for these machines. His current work explores the regulation of automated decision-making across IHL, ethics, and data protection law. With her presentation, Delphine van Solinge will allow us to delve into another very interesting topic, the spread of harmful information in humanitarian settings when technology is used in armed conflicts. Delphine has worked as advisor on digital risks for populations in armed conflicts in the Protection Division in Geneva since February 2018. She joined the ICRC in 2004 and worked as protection coordinator in Chad, the Philippines, Afghanistan, Colombia, and as head of the Global Protection Unit in Geneva. And prior to joining the ICRC, she worked with different NGOs in Africa. And apologies for this brief account of really the impressive backgrounds of both speakers. Delphine holds a master's in international relations and diplomacy from SOAS University, a master's in international humanitarian assistance from the University of Aix-en-Provence, and a master in international migration and human rights from the University of Kent. I want to give a warm welcome and express our thanks to the speakers for their presence. And now a brief note for you, the audience. Throughout the presentations, you can already send your questions in the chat, and I will share them with the speakers for, I hope, what will be a lively Q&A session, even though it's digital still. We would have loved to allow you all to participate with microphones and cameras, but this event was a victim of its success. And because there are really many of us connected, this would have been really difficult to manage. But I promise that I will do my best to put the questions together and get as many of them through to our speakers as possible. Joshua, the floor is yours to share your thoughts on this great topic.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the great introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honour. So my paper, with a very long title, unfortunately, focuses on deep learning in automatic target recognition. So first of all, what is deep learning, and why bother thinking about it? So you've probably heard about it, but maybe not in express terms. So deep learning is this relatively recent development in machine learning, and it's very powerful, and it's made some great successes. So you might have seen quite impressive deep fakes being created across the internet. Improvements in translation services, self-driving cars, the seemingly ever improvement in robotic movements, writing convincing text, natural language processing, image and video analytics, and maybe most famously beating Lee Sedol, who was the world champion at the board game Go, with the Google DeepMind system. So basically, deep learning has this ability or capability to do some really impressive and powerful things. So of course, why wouldn't you consider it for automatic target recognition as well? So what are they? Well, automatic target recognition systems are things that scan their environment for targets, basically using sensors to see what's out there and whether that could be suggested to a targeteer. And yeah, so people are beginning to experiment with using deep learning in these sorts of automatic target recognition systems, both in the US and in Russia, and probably other places as well. But deep learning has got lots of issues with it. It's not this panacea that perhaps the tech evangelists would make you think. So those issues will be translated into the automatic target recognition system. And for people who've been paying attention to the autonomous weapons systems debate, as Bruno mentioned, there's clear issues around, well, if the system suggests a target to a person, there's issues around automation bias. But then also if the system, this automatic target recognition system is included in an autonomous weapon system, then there's issues around the target will basically just be attacked by the system at the end. So yeah, so as I mentioned, there's lots of issues, but how does this stuff work? Well, if you think about algorithms, kind of the most simple algorithm you could think of is if X then Y, if X equals Y then Z. So it's linear, it's on a single line, because all the different variables get capped into one value, and that's X. But with deep learning, it splits up the task into many different variables, and it analyzes them individually, and then it combines the analysis. So there are many different layers, and it's the different layers that give it the deep learning. So rather than if X then Y, kind of Gary Marcus suggests this idea of in the I node in layer J in network module K. So it's much more complex. So if you say you wanted to have an automatic target recognition system that was looking at a tank, rather than saying this is a tank, that's the conclusion. Maybe the algorithm will look at the shape of it, the color of it, what the barrel looks like, what the different tracks look like, that type of thing. So it splits up the task into various different parts to make it, in the hope that it makes it more accurate and gives a better result, basically. But there are lots of issues with doing that. It sounds really good, but there are lots of issues in it. Some of them are about accuracy, which maybe I'll mention if I get time, but there are some more fundamental questions. about how these systems work. And armed conflict is a very high risk domain. If things go wrong, then lots of civilians could die, right? And we want to avoid that. That's the point of IHL to some degree, or from some perspectives. So these fundamental issues is an inability for these algorithms to deal with context. There's lots of contextual information in an armed conflict about how targets are selected, how targets are understood, and that context can't be comprehended by these machines or these algorithms. And the other thing is them being so complex that they're beyond human understanding. So I mentioned about the different layers and splitting the task up. Well, sometimes that can be so complicated and splitting the task into different compartments that actually it's difficult to connect things together. So it's some people it's impossible, or maybe it's impossible for anybody to really understand what's going on inside these algorithms. So I'll deal with the context issue first. As I mentioned, context is key to making an accurate decision on about whether a person or an object is an appropriate target or a lawful target. We wouldn't expect a machine to understand context because it's a machine, right? So these algorithms can't really deal with all the key information that should be considered or could be considered when thinking about a potential target. So that means that the system it can't know in inverted commas what a target is. It can only compare the data that's coming in from its sensors to the data that's in its memory and say, do these match up? Is that a target that's that it should attack or should suggest as a target to a person? So obviously this presents risks of violating principle of distinction, but also it poses questions about the military utility of these systems as well, or these types of algorithms in these systems. For example, if you've programmed to target this system to find targets based on the uniform of an adversary, but what about non-combatants? So medical and religious personnel who often wear the same uniform. There's a risk there that they might be, mistakenly attacked. People who are ordered combat but still wearing their uniform, there's a risk that they might be attacked as well. People who are wearing their uniform and perfectly legitimate target but are covered in dirt, mud, blood, whatever. The system might just miss them as a target, as a potential target. So there's those questions there about distinction and military utility. And then if you wanted to focus, say, target selection based on the presence of weapons, well, what about civilians who are armed for their own protection? There's questions there as well. If target selection is based on the presence of gunfire, for example, what about civilians who engage in celebratory gunfire? There's cases around that and how that sort of led to issues as well. So there are clear risks there for relying on deep learning for target selection. There's that context there that I mentioned that they can't. It's difficult to appreciate if you're relying on an algorithm, and this is maybe goes beyond deep learning as well to kind of to various different types of algorithms. But I think here it's quite useful to focus on it. So there's a risk that an automatic target recognition system could suggest an unlawful target either to its operator if it's a sort of a semi-autonomous system. And ideally the person would say, okay, that's not an appropriate target, that's not a lawful target, we won't go any further. But as I mentioned before, there's risks of automation bias. So this is where people begin to trust the outputs of computers more than themselves. So if the system suggests a target, the person might just push the button and let it go be attacked, really. That obviously feeds into the debate around meaningful human control, or in data protection law, people talk about token human involvement. And there are some options to reduce automation bias potentially that I'll maybe mention later on. Basically, sort of the summary of this sort of context issue is that without context, it's only possible for a deep learning automatic target recognition system to lawfully recognize sort of definitive military objects and uniforms, maybe. But to me, the usefulness of doing that is very narrow. And for me, the conclusion is that these sorts of targets should only be attacked sort of prior to any chance of an adversary being ordered combat, and where the absence of non-combatants, medical and religious personnel, meaning maybe aren't there, or maybe that absence can be generally maybe not guaranteed, but at least a good confidence. So yeah, so for me, the area where these systems could be used is very narrow. And then moving on to the other fundamental issue about the lack of explainability. so as I mentioned, these algorithms can be so complicated or complex that nobody really understands what's happening in them. So that would mean that nobody would be able to determine why a target was selected. It's impossible to understand whether the system is functioning as intended or not, because nobody can know whether it's focused on lawful targets. As I mentioned before, the algorithm kind of splits the task up into little different parts, so you don't really know whether the algorithm is going to be focused on the parts that relate to lawful targeting or something else. So there can be sort of this semblance of being correct. Perhaps the most famous story, and I think I mentioned it in the article as well, there was a US Army research project on computer vision, where they wanted to find an algorithm to find or to recognize enemy tanks. So they took lots of pictures of these enemy tanks on an open field one day, and then the next day they took pictures of the tanks in a forest. And the algorithm seemed to work perfectly, but what they had forgotten, well, what they had missed was that when they were pictures were taken on an open field, it was a cloudy day, and when they were in the forest, it was a sunny day. So actually the algorithm was focused on the clouds and the sun rather than the actual nature of the tank. So that's something called shortcut learning, and I was reading something about that yesterday in terms of COVID-19 X-rays, and the algorithm is focusing on the age of the patient that's noted in the corner of the X-ray rather than the actual image. So you can see there that there's a risk of a semblance of being correct where it's not acting as you want it to, but it seems like it is. And when that if you're using that algorithm to pick targets, maybe it ends up picking the wrong target. So if unlawful targets are included in the system's memory, then the principle of distinction, the rule of doubt, target verification rule, rule on indiscriminate attacks, potentially rules around environmental damage, they're going to be really difficult to comply with, maybe impossible in some situations. And, it comes down to, should a commander trust a system that they don't understand? For the commanders that I've spoken to on sort of the edges of the CCW meetings a few years ago, few of them would be willing to trust a system that they don't really understand. But I mean, what if they could, right? That would be a really good thing. So I mentioned in the article about this idea of explainable AI, and this is an approach or a research area where people are trying to overcome this lack of explainability and build algorithms in such a way that you can understand what's happening. And there's loads of people trying to do research in this and looking at it, but none of them have really been that successful. It's also domain dependent. So the approaches to explainable AI that might work in image recognition won't work in text recognition, for example, like that, or text analysis. So we're kind of stuck at the moment with this explainability problem, or the lack of explainability, and not really knowing what happens inside these algorithms. So it becomes really difficult. And the particular legal duties that I sort of explore in the article, for example, when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, sort of Sassoli has suggested that operators should understand the capabilities of the systems they're using, and roughly how it works. Maybe not need to go into the detail, but they should at least know how it works. So that wouldn't be possible if you can't comprehend what happens in the algorithm. And then in terms of command responsibility, part of command responsibility is to ensure that subordinates are human subordinates, are adequately trained in IHL, so as to prevent international crimes occurring. And if we can draw sort of a parallel from that to robotic forces, if we can call them those, talking about autonomous weapon systems, commander would have to ensure that systems can be used in compliance with IHL. And if they can't understand them, they can't assure that. So how can they prevent these systems being autonomous systems engaging in sort of international criminal acts? And there's parts of command responsibility can include having advisors in command centers or command situations. But again, having a computer science expert, they might not even be able to understand how these algorithms work. It's really cutting edge stuff is to try and understand how these algorithms work, and there are a few kind of concrete answers there. That issue around command responsibility, it might not be so much of a problem in a sort of a semi-autonomous system where the automatic target recognition system is suggesting targets to a person, because the person can say no. But obviously, as I mentioned, there's that issue around automation bias. And perhaps more, I don't know if it's a greater issue, but another big issue is around Article 36 reviews, the weapons reviews, which are legally required under Additional Protocol 1. How can you it's really difficult to review a system that you don't understand. How can you be sure it will function as intended? There are sort of approaches to understanding these things, sort of from computer science, as I mentioned, they're not really getting us great answers at the moment. But in terms of testing systems using these types of algorithms, simulations is one thing, but so running the algorithms against computer-generated simulations of battle space, but simulations aren't real, so you're not going to get real results or realistic results. Maybe there's test data from previous conflicts, but if you've trained an algorithm on to fight a particular adversary who you think you're going to go up against in a few years, well, you can't really test it against data from an adversary that you went up against 10 years ago. That doesn't work like that. And there are also these ideas of deep dreams, where you can run a deep learning algorithm backwards and you can sort of get some idea of what it's looking at or focused on, but it's really difficult to interpret that meaningfully. So for me, kind of one of the answers might be a physical facsimile, but then it calls into question how good the physical facsimile, sort of the testing ground, needs to be. So maybe this answers around sort of A/B testing it in a real scenario, real situation. So perhaps having the automatic target recognition system work in a semi-autonomous system with a person, and then testing that to see if it's any good and whether it could be used in a fully autonomous system. But maybe that's a question for another time. So to wrap up, because my time is rapidly running out, for me, if a deep learning programmed automatic target recognition system is using a semi-autonomous weapon system as a decision support tool, then combined with automation bias, there are risks of unlawful targeting, but there's chances that the automation bias can be dealt with in a proper way. Maybe that's meaningful human control, maybe that's other things, but that's maybe a discussion for another time or for Q&A. But if these sorts of these deep learning programmed systems are used in a fully autonomous system, where it makes the decision, there's significant risk of unlawful targeting, because there's no human fail-safe, there's no way of really understanding what it's doing. So ultimately, my conclusion really is that the use of deep learning in these systems is a design choice, and we can choose to build automatic target recognition systems and autonomous weapon systems in a different way. The risks associated with these technologies aren't going to be shouldered by us or the people making them. They're going to be shouldered by civilians who might be misidentified. And so, if we can make a choice to not use them, then generally, I think that, or at least until these algorithms, these systems are much better, then I think that's probably the right way to go. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joshua, and it's great food for thought. I think that it will raise questions in the audience. Maybe I should mention already that the forthcoming volume of the Yearbook of IHL contains a piece on Article 36 about the review of AI decision support systems. I think the author is also in the audience, so I'm sure it can trigger some discussions. I want to give you the floor, Delphine, to delve into how digital technologies and the spread of harmful information affects populations and humanitarian action. The floor is yours, Delphine.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you who are present today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So I'm sure that many of you have heard about those phenomena that are increasingly playing out online. You heard about misinformation, disinformation, information operation, propaganda, infodemic, I mean, you name it. Some call it the weaponization of information, and other the information disorder. At the ICRC, because we feel we are special, we use the acronym MDH for misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. For us, it refers to the most prominent type of harmful information spreading online. And during this 15-minute presentation, without being exhaustive, because this is impossible, I will first try to set the scene about MDH, and I will then give a brief overview of why MDH matter, in particular in humanitarian settings, what should be or could be done to address MDH. And again, it's not going to be exhaustive. Now, a way to describe MDH without entering into too many specific and become boring would be how information online and communication system are being used with the support of technology in ways that influence people, the way they see and perceive the world around them, the way they take decisions, and how this can contribute to harm. I don't want to go in every and each definition of the various phenomena of MDH, but maybe two of them, and I'm sure that all of you all know about it already, but just to make sure that we get the terminology out of the way. Misinformation is basically false information spread without the intent to cause harm or to deceive. Like the COVID pandemic, I think has been a big playground for misinformation to flourish. Like an example that a lot of people heard about is the miraculous cure of drinking cow urine to be safe from catching the COVID. Now, this information is false information as well, but it's created and spread with the intent to cause harm, to deceive the opponent, to affect the morale of the troops. And this information is a tactic which is often used during armed conflict to gain a strategic advantage on the opponent. In humanitarian setting, it can be about spreading lies against a minority group, leading to discrimination, or even direct attack, to a point where those people decide to flee to avoid persecution or even death. Now, I'm sure you will ask, okay, great, but what's so new about this? The truth is MDH are not new. It has always been part of our human landscape. But the digitalization of society and information ecosystem have introduced new paradigm of scale, speed, and reach. And today, harmful information spread across multiple digital platforms and audiences. These audiences consume, relay, and react to online content. And also thanks to the algorithm and the bots behind, designed to create, for example, the user view time or to increase content visibility. More and more information is being generated and amplified while maintaining people within their filter bubble. This is why we think that MDH is more pervasive, viral, and powerful than in the past. Some other characteristic about MDH phenomena, it's a growing phenomena and all states are confronted with it, irrespective of their economic, political, or culture. It's really all around the world. Recent examples include Nigeria, the US, the Brexit, you name it. There are many, many phenomena of MDH across the world. MDH also can have different level of intensity. It can be permanent, it can be ad hoc, it can be targeted, it can be systematic. In terms of intent, I mentioned before, it can be intentional, but it can be also organic or unintentional. We see also there are many, many actors involved. You can have state, proxy, media and tech company, but also lone individuals. In terms of focus, MDH can have a focus, for example, on the election. We've seen with the US election, it was kind of like a big thing. It can be on COVID, it can be on minority. And in terms of impact, it is multi-layered. And it's not always easy to assess or identify how it is spreading. We, however, see that more and more MDH has a huge impact on trust. People less and less believe and trust institution, media company, the government, the vaccine, or even the humanitarian organizations. And today, combined with AI capability, it can be expected that MDH are going to accelerate in frequency, in scale, in quality, and in reach. Consider, for example, bots army or socket puppet account targeting social news feeds to spread propaganda. The development of AI-based technology can make fake audio and video now almost undetectable. The line between the truth and falsehood online is becoming increasingly fragile. Recently, there has been a significant rise in the awareness of the issue, particularly in relation to elections and COVID. And at the same time, we also have seen that an improvement in the ability to identify and attribute incident of MDH. However, we also see that responses remain relatively limited, localized, and not always super efficient. We see that actors of MDH are increasingly able to adapt to platforms moderation policy and technique. Now you may ask, who is doing it? I already mentioned a little bit earlier, but pretty much everyone can spread MDH. It can be by individuals, organized groups, state, non-state actors, as well as private company with different degrees of sophistication and reach. How they're doing it? many ways, but basically they are creating compelling content that taps into emotions and feelings. They do this on the internet, in particular on social media platform, on news chat, blogs, and increasingly too on encrypted messaging app to avoid censorship. They also use a lot AI capability. I mentioned bots, fake account, but also targeted advertisement, personal phishing to better identify and target audiences that will be more receptive to their message and start spreading it. As I said, it's happening everywhere. Yet at this stage, there's very little attention given to what is happening in conflict-affected countries and to the impact that MDH has on the security and dignity of affected population, but also the ability of humanitarian actors to assist and protect those populations. Now that's the second point of this presentation. You may ask, why does it matter? Well, it does matter. In the last years, the ICRC made significant effort to better understand the risk and opportunity that digital technology bring to the people affected by conflict and violence. And one of our key findings and working assumption is that the rapid evolution of digital information technology is turning MDH into an exacerbating and accelerating driver of conflict dynamics, violence, and harm. It is an area of growing concern for humanitarian actors. We see 4 areas that deserve particular attention. The first one is that MDH can contribute directly or indirectly to humanitarian consequences affecting civilian population. The thing is that MDH may increase people's exposure to risk and vulnerability. It can lead to physical harm, for example, when online hate speech incite violence against a minority group. Here, I think we all remember the case of Myanmar and Facebook. It may also contribute to physical and social harm through online, offline harassment, defamation, or intimidation, which can in turn lead people to flee because they fear for their lives. I think it's an important point here to make that it's difficult to actually demonstrate the causal relationship between online content and offline harms. Those phenomena are, however, increasingly influential in humanitarian settings. I mentioned Myanmar, but it was also Ethiopia and Nigeria. Secondly, certain use of MDH can violate IHL and other rules of international law. The use of propaganda or mis or disinformation during armed conflict is not prohibited by IHL, but certain form of MDH can violate specific IHL rules. It can raise questions around accountability and attribution of responsibility in the digital space. And these questions are very relevant to the humanitarian dialogue on the conduct of hostility and other protection issues. Thirdly, MDH can undermine the acceptance and trust in humanitarian organization. False and manipulated information can cause reputational damage. They can erode the trust and undermine communities' acceptance of humanitarian organizations who are there also to serve them. This can have negative consequences on the capacity of humanitarian organizations to respond to the people's needs, which are then left unattended. And fourthly, MDH can also lead to security issues such as direct online threat or attack against humanitarian staff. An organization or its employee can be the target of MDH through, for example, defamatory social media campaign. Online attack can be planned, politically motivated, or unfold in a more organic manner as a result of a misunderstanding or a serious discontent with the behavior response provided by a humanitarian organization. At the ICRC, as I mentioned, we have been looking at this for a couple of years now. And what have we done concretely? We have been looking at this issue and noticed a big knowledge gap. And here I want to insist, because I know that in this audience, there's a lot of researchers and people working on academic topics. So I think here it is also a kind of a hint. At our level, we have conducted exploratory work on MDH in Ethiopia and Sri Lanka. We are now also working with Yale University on a research to practice initiative that will include 5 case studies of MDH to understand better the relationship between online content and offline humanitarian consequences. But this is it's only a very start. We need more people to get to work on this, to understand better how all these phenomena impact people in armed conflict. To the question, what can be done? I think that in terms of solution, I don't have one, and I'm not sure there's one. There's no silver bullet to solve this wicked problem. It actually requires a cross-sectoral approach with serious commitment on all sides to invest time, energy, and also money. It's an endeavor where not only the humanitarian sector, but also state, tech companies, donors, academia need to roll up their sleeves. If I had to summarize 4 key takeaways about MDH in humanitarian sector, it would go like this. The first thing is about bringing the conflict setting dimension into the picture of those conversations around the information disorder or MDH. Because contexts affected by conflict and violence are potentially more vulnerable to the negative impact of MDH, because there are often much less means, prevention, and resilience mechanism to mitigate the effect on already very vulnerable populations. Second, we need the humanitarian sector to get together and start engaging on those issues jointly, and not only about how MDH is affecting their organization, but also on how it is affecting communities on the ground. And I think one point which is very important is that those very community needs to be part of those conversations. The third thing is that we need research to address the current knowledge gap that exists around MDH and humanitarian consequences, and also on how IHL can apply to those situations involving MDH. Fourth, we need that all relevant stakeholders, including the tech and private industry, government, donors, media, companies, civil society, academia, who work on the challenges that MDH raises, to include a conflict sensitivity lens in their analysis and their response. For example, when they develop a new app, when they carry out new research, or when they do advocacy. Because if the issue of MDH in armed conflict is not addressed, there's a risk that it will contribute to further entrenching violence in already very volatile environment and protracted conflict. It will continue to deepen existing political and socio-economic tension, and it will further erode the social fabric and stability in those countries, with potentially spillover effect at the regional and global level. To conclude, MDH in armed conflicts should be considered as an important area of concern for the humanitarian sector and beyond. It is time for relevant actors across all sectors to bridge the current gap by incorporating this issue into their strategy, their policy and operation, while also providing the necessary resource support to enable their staff to consider these additional issues into their work. Developing this knowledge and bridging this gap will also help to inform humanitarian diplomacy effort and advocacy effort. We need to get moving on those things, because the truth is we have a blind spot when it comes to conflict and MDH. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delphine, for this extremely interesting presentation. And I want, without further ado, to kick off the Q&A session. We have quite a lot of questions already, and maybe because our mind is fresh on these issues of MDH, I will start with questions related to this topic. Of course, we will try to establish a link between and enter in conversation all together as well, but I feel that there are specific questions also that are to be addressed for both topics. So maybe trying to put together 2 questions. Delphine, someone is asking if there has been, you mentioned it at some point, that there are 5 case studies that you are exploring, and someone is asking if there has been documented cases of MDH to incite genocide specifically, but I should add maybe other international crimes in conjunction with digital technologies. Because of course we have examples in recent history where information and communication systems have demonstrated their capacity to generate harm, such as in the case of Radio Milcolin in Rwanda. But could you share with us specific examples with digital technologies? And maybe a related question that I could put with this one, if you could also share, in your view, what are the concrete rules or principles of IHL that could be violated directly or indirectly in cases of misinformation?
So to the first question, at the ICRC, we have not been able to document this thoroughly. So that would be the short and quick answer to it. But I do expect that others might have done it, especially from a genocide perspective. So that would be the short answer to a long question. I'm sorry for for being so laconic on this. In terms of the law, there's, for instance, the fact that IHL prohibits acts of threat of violence, the primary purpose, which is to spread terror among civilian population. And this means that MDH that threaten violence are prohibited if it can be shown that the primary purpose of such activity is to spread terror among the civilian population. I don't remember exactly. I think it's in the protocol, first protocol of the Geneva Convention. And also parties to an armed conflict are prohibited from encouraging violation of IHL, including through MDH. So that would be the common Article 1 of the Geneva Convention. I think that more broadly, we can say that forms of MDH may trigger states' responsibility under international human rights law, which continue to apply during armed conflict and other situations of violence. So, but this is more like human rights law. For IHL, it's a little bit what I mentioned now.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's already very helpful. I will give you a break, Delphine, and ask a question now to Joshua. A lot of questions are popping up on both issues. So maybe the first one is a general one that I could ask. So you point to the issues that are raised by autonomous weapon systems, but one of the persons in the audience asks, does it mean that if or when manufacturers manage to build autonomous weapon systems that overcome the barriers that you're mentioning, or at least perform better than humans, will that mean that IHL will be fine with autonomous weapon systems? And the author goes a little bit, the person goes a little bit further by saying that she feels that we shouldn't have to argue with legal and technical arguments, as this could become obsolete, and rather have a more open or broader argument against this use, thinking that war has to remain between human hands and not given to machines. I'm quoting the question. So what are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I've sort of noticed in the debate on autonomous weapon systems is there's at least sort of two major camps, really. And one is this sort of very traditional IHL camp of, you know, if it fulfills the rules, then that's okay, and we can use it and it'll be fine. And there's the other camp that's maybe in the sort of Theodore Meron's humanization tradition. It's a bit like, well, you know, the rules are the rules, but is that what we really want to do? And is that the direction we really want to go? And so for me, I think it depends maybe which camp you're in, but also kind of how you think we should approach this stuff. And as I sort of mentioned, I think, you know, the choice, it's a choice to use these sort of systems, and we don't have to make that choice to use them if we don't really want to, or if some people don't want to. So yeah, I mean, it goes back to that sort of question that was sort of popular in the late 90s or early 2000s of it's lawful but awful. And I think that kind of encapsulates it, really, you know. Yeah, I mean, in my PhD, I sort of did, you know, make an argument that these systems, fully autonomous weapon systems, could be used lawfully, but in very narrow circumstances and with very much quite significant levels of human control. Maybe not the same type of control as the sort of meaningful human control concept. So for me, it's about picking sort of a way in between, really, and saying, okay, the machines, we're going to delegate these particular things to machines, but we're going to make sure that humans do these other things. to make sure they're used in a proper way. And for me, that's making sure the human-machine relationship is appropriate. I think is quite key. It's almost I wouldn't say it's easy to make the argument that when these systems fulfill IHL criteria, they're going to be fine. But a lot of people do it, and it's I suppose it's fine to do. But for me, I think there's extra steps to be done there about actually what do we want the human role to be, and where do we want human beings to stay in this sort of I suppose the common parlance and the term of art is decision-making loop, isn't it? So for me, I think that's something that we need to decide. And I suppose the work of the CCW is going a long way to do that. Did I answer the full question? Was there a second part to that I missed?
No, I think it addresses the question, and maybe a related one that I saw passing by earlier, which is slightly related. So you mentioned how context also, the complexity of context is difficult to grasp by these machines. So looking a little bit further into this issue, couldn't we say that also autonomous weapon systems somehow change the way of conducting warfare and trigger a shift towards more anticipatory warfare? So one that would tackle individuals before acts of hostilities are actually perpetrated, and that therefore this exacerbates the context concern that you're having. So yeah, I will leave it there because I'm trying to sum up different things together.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there's perhaps I think there's two issues. I think one is that sort of the full embrace of machines tends to bring with it sort of an embrace of machine logics, and viewing sort of subjects of the work that's done, or in this case the targeting, as though thinking like machines basically. One of my friends has done quite a lot of research onto how sort of the use of technology in warfare sort of leads to people behaving more like robots rather than we sometimes think about robots becoming more human, but actually it seems like it's perhaps the other way around. But in terms of how that could affect sort of IHL, I think there's quite a good case study or example from sort of the idea of predictive policing. And sort of lots of tech manufacturers sort of suggest they have these sort of predictive policing tools, and they go to police departments and say, we can tell you where crime's going to happen. And then you actually look at what the machines do, and it's much simpler, and they can't really do that at all. So I could very much imagine, a tech company or a defense tech company coming in and saying, we can predict terrorist targets for you to attack in a few days' time or something like that, or we can predict the terrorist who's going to plant a bomb in a week, and you can go and drone strike them, that type of thing. In fact, there's probably people already doing it, but we looking at those sort of machine logics and thinking about how actually that type of thing happens in other sectors, it sort of shows that there are many errors in that, and I don't think I would trust anything like that at all to do this type of thing. I mean, there are many failures when it comes to just arresting people, and that's in some cases it's been a violation of human rights, and it's also just deeply unfortunate. But if you're going to end up attacking somebody and they're going to die, then to trust a machine with prediction when we know that level of prediction is a joke in some ways, is going to be a bit, it's not something I would do.
Thanks a lot, Joshua. Maybe a last question before moving back to the question of MDH. So there is a question from the author of the article that I mentioned earlier, Claudia Klonowska. So a question to Dr. Hughes. I'm interested in your distinction between autonomous deep learning systems and decision aid deep learning systems. You mentioned that a deep learning system, when autonomous, can only be used in narrow cases where there are no civilians. In cases where the system is not autonomous, but is embedded in an ISR system to provide situational awareness and support targeting decisions, would you argue for the same limitations to their use? Or would the limited autonomy of target engagement and the potential role of human in assessing the context merit their use as decision aids?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think for me, I think it goes back to that automation bias issue, really. If the automatic target recognition system is really being used as a decision aid, a decision support tool, maybe to prioritize potential targets, or for sort of a human being to suggest targets that the human being can then decide and think about properly and adequately with adequate time, then no, I wouldn't put those limits on it, because it's still that human decision. But for me, those limits would be most relevant for where it's sort of a fully autonomous system, simply because of the errors in it. Those errors, or potential for errors, I should say. If it's fully autonomous, those errors they don't just stop at the target recognition stage; they go all the way through to a potential unlawful attack. Whereas if it's really just a decision aid and decision support tool, those errors can be prevented from manifesting in undesirable ways or unlawful ways, sort of by the human being. So yeah, I think if it's decision aid and it's really is used as an aid, and automation bias can be prevented, then I wouldn't put the same sorts of limits on them.
Thanks a lot. I try to go from the least and to the most technical questions. And now moving back to the issue of MDH, a few other questions for you, Delphine. First, someone is interested in, at some point you talked about how the digital space exacerbates the risks of misinformation for civilian populations and humanitarian action. So could you expand a little bit on this idea, on what differentiates risks of misinformation in the digital space and outside such a space?
Sure, thank you. And I just wanted to briefly come back to the previous question. I think that in terms of what has been documented recently on, for example, incitement to genocide and MDH, there has been the UN fact-finding mission for Myanmar, which has gone through at length about the implication and the role of Facebook in spreading disinformation and hate speech against the Rohingya community. And those allegations has been covered quite extensively in this report. So that's one which is also available publicly. But I also want to make a point here is that, and this was mentioned during my intervention, is the fact that today one of our main challenge is how can what is the relationship between online content and real world consequences? There's obviously, we see an influence, but to clearly determine the level of implication of influence of online content on actual on the situation on the ground, it is extremely tricky, because you have to take into account different parameters. The first one, and we have a framework for that we use at the ICRC, are the foundational elements. Then you have the pathway, and then you have the signal. And the foundational element, I think, also goes back to what Joshua was mentioning. It's about the context. Each context is going to be different. And each context is going to have its specificity, its history, its own internal dynamics, which will make a population or a place more susceptible to MDH. And if you don't know the context, it's going to be very difficult to apply a one-fits-all rule about whether or not MDH is going to take up. So I just wanted to clarify this. Now, on the question, can you repeat that again for me so that I'm sure that I...
Yeah, so what differentiates risks of misinformation in the digital space and outside that space? If you can expand on what you mean by it extrapolates, it exacerbates the risk.
Sure. So I'm gonna take again a metaphor that I used recently, and it's about how to make cupcakes. So we all know how to make cupcakes. I mean, I learned recently, but cupcakes, you need your ingredient. You need flour, you need butter, you need eggs, you need milk. And this is with that, you make the dough, right? And then you need the mold, and then you need an oven. And that's basically how you will make cupcakes. And it's pretty much the same about MDH. Before, in the analog world only, we had the flour, which was, as I mentioned, the foundational element that make a context more susceptible or not. you have the ovent, and then you have the mold. That, you know, how it's going to be transmitted. Is it going to be radio? Is it going to be like print paper, etc., etc. Then you have the audience. What happened on the digital space is that you still have the same ingredient, pretty much the same, but you have a supersonic like oven, and you have millions of molds. So when you bake your cupcake, you're not only going to have one, but you're going to have zillion of this. And what is happening on digital platform that you don't necessarily have on a radio is that you have an algorithm which is working behind the scene and is analyzing your preferences, what you're reading, what you're clicking on, what are your contacts you're more interested, your pages that you're more interested, and it's gonna like give you again the same thing that you like, because the platform wants you to stay on the platform. And then you have also other types of technology that are designed to really amplify the content. And there you have bots, you have army of bots, you have fake accounts that, thanks to the algorithm, can also spread content at a pace that radio cannot do. And then you have everyone who is online, and increasingly everyone is partaking in those conversations. When you had the radio before, you had the guy on the radio giving the show, and then maybe you had some people calling and give their opinion on this. But today, no one prevents me to give all my thoughts on Facebook or on Twitter, and everyone. No one is, unless I'm like really violating the terms of the company. But it's really everyone can speak, everyone can say what they want, almost. And then you have the technology behind it that is able to amplify, to multiply, and to increase the speed of how fast a message is going to reach multiple audiences. And this you didn't have before. And what makes MDH Online also very strong is that the analog is still there, meaning that your content, your conversation you're going to have online, you can also have it, if you're not totally like cut out from the world, you're going to have it also with your peers. And you have the word of mouth in many contexts, which also very strong. So it's like amplifying in all direction through different means.
Thank you so much. I think the analogy is great, and your answer to this question allows to actually identify really the specificity of what it is that you're describing, and probably I see it as really a success of our discussion so far, is that we have been able to point to the specificity of these different types of technology in raising challenges and issues in IHL and delivery of human action today. Maybe a final question to you, Delphine, because this is another fascinating point that you raise, and a challenge, of course, for the topic you mentioned. So you mentioned the difficulty to establish causality between online content and offline harm. I think this is a crucial point that will deserve indeed much more attention in the future. And someone is asking, in light of this difficulty, is there room, in your view, for international criminal law or criminal law in general to regulate MDH?
So the thing about regulation, it's always a double-edged weapon in a way. So it can be good to have some regulation, but the regulation, we also have to be careful that it's not turned against, for example, freedom of expression and extreme censorship, and abuse by some regime or people to silence the voice of the people. So I think here it's a very important question, and I think a question that is currently breaking the head of many people, because we will need to find a way at the regulatory level to ensure that there's more a clear framework to know how we address MDH from, for example, a criminal perspective, without infringing on the rights of the people to the extent that we are in another extreme situation. The thing with regulation is like, if each country starts to have its own regulation, we're going to have a patchwork of responses to MDH, and we already see that, which are not very effective. So that's the first point. And second is like, who has the authority to decide when MDH is becoming a serious violation and really causing harm to the extent that it deserves an intervention? Who will have this authority in this world of distrust? And these are very philosophical but yet important questions that I think will take time. And as it takes time, the technology goes faster and faster. So it's a very tricky situation where I think that's why we really say that the approach should not be siloed. The approach should like bring the relevant people around the table, including those who are directly affected, to have a meaningful conversation about your way forward. And I think a very important aspect of it is also to make sure that you have the technology, but very importantly, behind the technology or with the technology, you have human behavior. And this is very complicated.
Thank you so much. And I'm a little bit mindful of time. I know that you're all quite busy. I would like to give the opportunity maybe to Christophe or Bruno to switch on their camera if they have questions themselves. We had many questions from the audience. I tried to put them all together. So I think, yeah, I think knowing them, they want just to give the priority to the questions that were asked by the audience. I want to thank you very much, Joshua and Delphine, for these fascinating presentations and for the great answers that you gave to the questions that were forwarded to you. I see a lot of people thanking you for the great webinar and engagement and interactions. And before we leave you all, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Frank Becker from T.M.C. Asser Press. Frank, the floor is yours. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, that's fine then. Thank you, Rebecca, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words to the many participants in this webinar. That happens to be also the book launch of the Asser Press Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law, Volume 21, and the International Review of the Red Cross, Volume 102, published by Cambridge University Press. Both publications have been devoted to the topics of IHL and digital technology that were so critically and well examined in the presentations of the speakers. The ties between the Asser Institute and the International Review of the Red Cross are strong, and it's good that we could organize this webinar together on this rising topic in modern warfare and IHL. I remember the event in 2016, also organized on the basis of our publications, and I look forward to more cooperations and events in the near future. In my capacity of publisher of the yearbook, I invite you all to visit the Asser Press website, where on the information page for this book you will find for this occasion an offer of a special discount on the list price. I will keep it short. I will wrap this event up. I thank both speakers for their contributions to this webinar, my colleague Rebecca for excellent moderating, and I thank you, the audience, for your presence and participation, and I hope to see you again at one of our events in the future, in person or in cyberspace. Thank you very much, goodbye, and take care.